In this particular segment, The Flickering Flame of Reason, we will be dealing with one of the most difficult philosophical ideas that has made inroads into our culture. You remember, as we defined pluralism, we said where there were existent a competing number of worldviews and no one worldview was dominant. Now we will deal with the ramifications of that idea. One of the truisms that I'm sure you have heard, I have heard, and it sort of floats into our thinking, is that everything is relative, that all statements are equally true. But just think about it for a moment. Nobody ever pauses to tell you relative to what? Is it relative to my community? Is it relative to my religiosity? Is it relative to my ethnicity? Is it relative to my academic training? The best answer anyone comes up with is to tell you that it is relative to you as an individual. But if all truth is relative to the individual, then what about the individual who says all truth is absolute? By its own terms, relativism has to grant that individual the right to believe that because it is relative to him or to her. But this is where we see what happens when a sophisticated idea is carried over into our lifestyles. And once again, history, literature, experience are all replete with examples of what happens when you hold the finger of a small idea and forget the fist of falsities that are smuggled in the process. Let us define our terms. Sociologist Daniel Bell helps us here. He says culture is an effort to find a coherent set of answers to the existentialist situations that confront all of us in the passage of our lives, which means coherence is the goal. The questions are common, and we are looking for answers that can satisfy all. You can immediately see how relativism runs aground and ends up with very serious and critical problems. Let me show you how these issues of relativism play out and how the breakdown comes, first in the thought processes or philosophically, then how they work themselves into society on the issues that are confronting all of us, and finally, what happens even individually as we seek for coherent answers to the questions that confront us in the passage of our lives. First, let us look at it philosophically. Now, here's where you're going to have to think hard, and please give me your undivided attention. I am sure that once you hang on to the argument, you will understand why it was so important for me to illustrate it for you this way. I've actually gone to greater lengths in explaining it in some of my other writings, so let me do my best to simplify it and anchor it for our understanding here. Some years ago, I was speaking in one of America's West Coast cities. It was a series of meetings, and I was talking about the uniqueness of Christ and answering the questions as to why one could defend that Jesus was the way, the truth, and the life. A lot of students were coming, professors from the local colleges and universities started to attend, and one particular professor was not too pleased with the approach that I was taking. In fact, he was rather exasperated. So he walked forward one evening, and he said to me, Mr. Zacharias, I'd like you to do something. I'd like you to take one of these nights to tell us why you are not A, and he named another particular religion, let us call it X. Why you do not follow Xism, why you are not an X. He said, because I happen to be a believer in that system, and I'd love to hear you why you are not a believer in that too. I said, look, I'm not here for that. I can't be arguing against everything in particular, but I'll be glad to at least establish why I am a Christian. He didn't quite like that. He said, I dare you to do it, and if you will do it tomorrow night, I'll bring my whole class in philosophy, and we'll tear you apart, tear you to shreds by the time you're through. Well, I didn't find that very encouraging. I said, let's make an understanding here. If I do present to you why I am a Christian, implicit in those answers will be why I am not anything else. And then after that, we can talk. He sort of hooed and hawed and decided to come, brought his whole class with him. So I presented the case of my personal conviction and commitment to the person of Christ. As it was over, and by the way, I should mention that through my talk, I also gave reasons why I could not see any other system of truth, particularly the one that he had named as holding to a coherent set of answers. So he stormed forward to the front And he said this to me, this was his opening line: "You have done more disservice to that particular system of X than I have ever heard any man ever do." And he said, and the reason is you don't understand it. Well, it was rather surprising that he would say that, because that indeed was one of the belief systems under which I was raised, in the land where I was raised, and now he, from another part of the world, was accusing me that I didn't understand that worldview, but I wasn't going to get into another argument. So I finally said, look, let's do it this way. You're going to try to impress your students. I'm going to try and win this argument here, and that's really not what we're pursuing. Why don't we go out for lunch and talk about it? You pay, and I'll pray, and I'll answer the questions you have. He finally gave in, and the next day we went out for lunch. Interestingly enough, as he brought another professor with him and we sat down at the table, you got to hear this, he took all the placemats around every table that he could reach for, and he started to build his argument in this fashion. He said, Ravi, there are two types of logic. Actually, he was wrong there, but I wasn't going to stop him that early. He said there are two types of logic. One is the law of non-contradiction, the either-or kind of logic. It is either this or that. He said the other is the dialectical system, which is both this and that. Some of you may be familiar with Marxism, for example. It works out from a dialectical system. It is not either the employer or the employee. They blend together to form a classless society. Interestingly enough, nobody ever shows you one, but certainly Marx operated from the dialectical principle. Now follow me here. He said there are two kinds of logic: the law of non-contradiction, either or the dialectical system, which is both and, where you don't ask the either or question. Two opposite statements can both be blended and synthesized in some way. Now, interestingly enough, this is where he began to make his fatal slip. Now, I have always said this, that you allow any relativist to talk long enough and he or she will ultimately hang themselves. And here's where his first mistake came. He said the law of non-contradiction, either or, is a Western way of thinking. We Westerners, said he, think in an either-or system. The Easterners think in a both-and dialectical system. So if you ask one Easterner, is God personal? And he says yes. And you ask another Easterner, is God personal? And she says no. And you ask a third one, he says to me, which of these is right? He'll say both of them. He says, you see, they do not believe in this either-or system of logic. Now came his conclusion. He said, Ravi, what you need to do when you're studying this philosophy and religion X, rather than studying it like a Westerner with an either-or system, you should study it like an Easterner with a both-and system. And so if you see a contradiction, it will not bother you. They can be loaded with contradictions, and if you allow for contradictions, it ought not to be troubling. Here he was, waxing eloquent, either or, both and. When you're studying X, you use the both and system rather than either or, so that contradictions will not bother you. I was enjoying my lunch, and so was the other professor. This fellow's plate had become completely congealed. He hadn't even touched it yet, building this either or versus both and. And when he finally finished and said, when you're studying System X, you should use the both-and system rather than the either-or, he picked up his knife and fork, and I looked at him and I said, sir, I have just one question for you, if you can help me with a clarification. What you're telling me is when I study X, I either use the both-and system of logic or nothing else. Is that right? I either use the both-and system of logic or nothing else. Is that right? Do you know, he put his knife and fork down, and I wished I'd had a camera with me then too. And he looked at me and said, the either-or does seem to emerge, doesn't it? I said, yes, sir, indeed it does emerge. I said, you'll be fascinated to know that even in India, we look both ways before we cross the street. It is either the bus or me, not both of us. Do you see what he was doing? Please understand this. He was really using the either-or with which to prove the both-and. His relativism began to collapse before his eyes because he was arguing for one system over against another, which means one was right and the other wasn't. This is where the breakdown comes, intellectually and philosophically. Now let me demonstrate for you how this contradiction works itself out socially. Let me alert you to the fact that I'm keenly aware of how sensitive this illustration will be, and for some you might find it impossible to be neutral, but please just take note, as painful as it may be for some of us to discuss this issue, the fact is that it is very real. And these are the questions that we existentially struggle with in the passage of our lives that we now face socially. I happened to be at a very prestigious university in the United States. I'd teamed up with another well-known scientist, and we were on an open-line talk show. We were discussing the issues generally of theism versus atheism. And the callers began to call from all over, a lot of angry callers, a lot of insolent ones. They just did not want us defending theism. Right out of the blue, when the subject wasn't even being discussed, one woman angrily called in an outburst and told us that we all really had an agenda as theists. And what that agenda was, a kind of an anti-abortion stand, she said, and we just smuggle in that issue with everything else that we put up in front. But these are the nitty-gritty issues, she said. I said, Madam, we did not even bring up the issue of abortion. She said, I know, but that's what is really behind the agenda of all of you theists. And then she went on to say this, putting me on the spot. What is your position on it anyway, she said. I said, why don't you tell me what yours is? She said, I believe it is my moral right to make my own decisions on this life within me. It is my own moral right. No one else ought to interfere in that. I said, Madam, then you can help me with another question, and I would appreciate your answer. I said, listening to what you're saying about your moral right on this decision, I think back of the number of campuses I've been on, and sooner or later somebody stands up from his or her seat and says something like this. They say, Mr. Zacharias, when a plane is flying and suddenly crashes for no apparent reason, 30 people die, 10 people live. This was under the sovereign will of God, as it were, an act of God. Isn't it interesting, whenever anything bad happens, we want to call it an act of God. But then I made this point, that the questioner would say, so many people live and so many people die, and with God in complete control and sovereign. What sort of a God is that, they would say? This is an immoral act, taking the life of some and retaining the life of others. I said, Madam, would you help me understand this conundrum now? Why is it, if God makes a choice for some to live and some not to, you call it immoral? But when you make the choice of what should live and what should die within you, you call that a moral right. Will you explain this contradiction for me? There was silence on the other side of the telephone. And interestingly enough, even the host, who was an atheist, just dropped his eyes and his glance from me for a moment, doodling away on the paper in front of him, wondering how he would respond to that. But you see, when philosophy has worked itself and its way into society, these are the kinds of issues that end up ultimately tearing us apart while we look for coherent answers to the existential questions that confront all of us in the passage of our lives. It was this terrifying contradiction that G.K. Chesterton spoke of over half a century ago when he talked about individuals who wanted to rebel against everything and wanted to see no absolutes of any kind. In his book, Orthodoxy, he gives this profound thought. Please take note of it, because herein is contained the germ of what happens to pluralism if it is ultimately extrapolated into ethical relativism. He talks about the one rebelling against all absolutes, and he says this: the new rebel is a skeptic and will not entirely trust anything. He has no loyalty. Therefore, he can never be really a revolutionist. And the fact that he doubts everything gets in his way when he wants to denounce anything. For all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind. And the modern revolutionist doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. Thus, he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women, and then he writes another book, a novel, in which he insults it himself. He curses the Sultan because Christian girls lose their virginity, and then curses Mrs. Grundy because they keep it. As a politician, he will cry out that war is a waste of life, and then as a philosopher, that all life is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, and then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, and then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. He calls a flag a bauble and then blames the oppressors of Poland or Ireland because they take away that bauble. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes on to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is always engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality, and in his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt has become practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he has lost his right to rebel against anything. It was in the 1980s that Daniel Yankelovich in Psychology Today wrote an outstanding article, New Rules in American Life, The Search for Self-Fulfillment in a Culture Turned Upside Down. Part of the article contained a study that he had done with several couples. One of them he called Abby and Mark, and he discusses all of their dreams, their allurements, what it is they really want to accomplish in their lives. And then he comes through a three-stage process to show how it has broken down in their own lives. And he says that he begins by saying this: if you feel it is imperative to fill all your needs, and if these needs are contradictory or in conflict with those of others or simply unfillable, then frustration inevitably follows. To Abby and to Mark as well, self-fulfillment means having a career and marriage and children and sexual freedom and autonomy and being liberal and having money and choosing nonconformity and insisting on social justice and enjoying city life and country living and simplicity and graciousness and reading and good friends and on and on and on. He continues with this: the individual is not truly fulfilled by becoming even more autonomous. Indeed, to move too far in this direction, he says, is to risk psychosis, the ultimate form of autonomy. And then this postscript: the injunction that to find oneself, one must lose oneself, contains a truth any self-fulfillment seeker needs to grasp. Isn't it interesting? Yankelovich, writing from a secular perspective, recognized that there were just too many ands in a culture that wanted so much. The both hand had to give way at some point to the either-or. But this is really the plague of relativism. In trying to find truth and reason as relative to the individual, we end up with such confusion. And what's happened in our society now, with all kinds of diversities, we have only ended up with pockets of people, many of whom have chosen to hate those who hold on to a different perspective. When we looked at secularization, where there was a loss of a sense of shame, we could end up hurting those whom we love. Now in pluralization, with the death of reason, you can end up choosing to hate, and that perpetrates itself, multiplies itself in a society where so many walls are being erected. Where reason has died, unity will die, and diversity will increase, and hate can be fostered if there's nothing to unify us and find coherence to the existential questions of life that all of us at some stage confront. Pluralization may be a noble idea, but if its fundamental precept does away with truth, then you find the contradiction and ultimately the hate that is bred in a diverse society.